Remember, there's only room for one sovereign at a time, not two. So you can't be the same as the sovereign.
The palace tried to hide this letter. They never wanted King Charles to see it. But when it landed on his desk, everything exploded. Witnesses say he collapsed, shaking uncontrollably as he read words that could destroy Queen Camilla forever.
May thy servant Camilla, who wears this crown, be filled by thine abundant grace.
This wasn't just gossip. This was proof. Proof of a secret so dangerous it could end her reign in 24 hours. Someone's been waiting decades to expose this.
As I stand before you today, I cannot help but feel the weight of history.
The question that's terrifying Buckingham Palace right now: who sent it and what do they want? Charles sat alone in his private study that night, having dismissed every advisor and secretary hours earlier. The unusual request for complete solitude had sent ripples of concern through the palace staff. Guards stood at their posts with tension in their shoulders, exchanging worried glances. Something catastrophic was unfolding behind those closed doors, though none of them could say exactly what. The king looked exhausted, older than his years. The soft glow of his desk lamp cast shadows across his pale face as he stared at the envelope before him. There was no royal crest, no official letterhead, no return address. Just handwriting that seemed both familiar and foreign, enough to make his stomach clench with an inexplicable sense of dread. For nearly an hour, he simply stared at it. His hand would reach forward, then pull back, as if some instinct warned him that once he broke that seal, nothing would ever be the same. Outside his locked door, the palace continued its usual rhythm. Staff prepared for the next day's engagements, security made their rounds, and the ancient machinery of monarchy ground forward as it had for centuries. But inside that study, time seemed frozen. Charles understood something that most people never have to confront in their lives. Some truths once known can never be unknown. Some pieces of information have the power to destroy everything a person has spent a lifetime building. Finally, his fingers moved to break the seal. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the suffocating silence. He pulled out several sheets of heavy paper that carried the faint smell of age and careful preservation. The first paragraph hit him like a physical blow. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes moved across words that seemed impossible, that contradicted everything he thought he understood about his marriage to Camilla and her position within the royal family. His hands began shaking so violently that the paper rattled. He had to set it down on the desk before he dropped it. A single sentence near the bottom of that opening page made his vision blur and the room spin around him. He gripped the edge of his desk to steady himself against a wave of nausea. He read that sentence again, then a third time. Each repetition made it more real, more devastating, forcing him to confront a reality he had never imagined possible. This wasn't what he expected. Not blackmail, not a personal grievance, not even a political attack from those who had never accepted his marriage to Camilla. This was something far more dangerous because it was institutional. It came from within the very structures that held up the monarchy itself. The letter documented something that had the power to destroy everything they had built together over decades of struggle and public criticism. According to the letter, a secret agreement had been reached years before Charles married Camilla. An arrangement negotiated between palace advisors and Camilla herself regarding the specific conditions under which she would be accepted into the royal family. Charles's hands clenched as he read descriptions of meetings he had never been told about, conversations that had apparently taken place without his knowledge or consent, decisions made about his life and his future while he was deliberately kept in the dark. The letter stated that Camilla had been given a choice by representatives of the monarchy. She could marry Charles and eventually become his queen, but only if she agreed to specific restrictions on her power, her influence, and her ability to shape the institution she was entering. According to the documentation, she had accepted those terms without hesitation, desperate enough for legitimacy that she would have agreed to almost anything in exchange for the position she had wanted for so long. The specific terms outlined in the letter made Charles physically ill as he absorbed their implications. Camilla had apparently agreed that her position would always be conditional, subject to review if she overstepped clearly defined boundaries. She had promised to remain largely ceremonial, to avoid attempting to influence policy or matters of succession, to accept that her role would always be subordinate in ways that went beyond normal royal protocol. Most devastatingly, she had agreed that if she violated these terms, or if her presence became politically problematic for any reason, she could be removed from her position without Charles having any say in the subsidiaries. Decision. The letter indicated these agreements had been documented, signed, and sealed, then stored in archives that were not controlled by the palace, but by other institutions within the British establishment that had their own interests in maintaining stability. Charles read these passages multiple times, unable to believe that Camilla would have agreed to such conditions. He couldn't reconcile this information with the strong, determined woman he thought he knew so well. But the letter's language was clear and specific, detailing not just the historical agreements, but also their present-day consequences. The letter explained that Camilla had violated the terms of her agreement through specific actions. She had attempted to influence matters of succession, had made decisions about palace operations that exceeded her authorized role, and had built networks of loyalty among staff and advisors that the institution viewed as threatening to proper hierarchies. Whether these accusations were fair or exaggerated hardly mattered now. What mattered was that they were documented, that evidence existed to support them, and that the people who controlled that evidence had decided the time had come to enforce consequences. Charles realized with terrible clarity that he wasn't reading a threat. This was a notification, an explanation of actions that were already in motion, regardless of his feelings about their justice or necessity. The letter made clear this wasn't blackmail seeking his compliance with demands. It was simply professional courtesy, informing him of institutional decisions that had been made in rooms he had no access to, by people whose power existed before his crown and would continue long after his reign ended. The constitutional language embedded throughout the letter made Charles understand he was facing forces he could not overcome through will or royal authority alone. The British monarchy has survived for centuries through careful balance with other power structures. Parliament, the church, the aristocracy, the military, the financial institutions that fund national operations. All of these have their own requirements for stability and continuity. The letter suggested that Camilla had become a liability in the eyes of people who controlled access to resources and legitimacy that even a king depended on for effective rule. Charles set the letter down again, his mind racing through possible responses, searching desperately for some way to protect his wife from what was coming. He found nothing. Every option led to consequences that would damage the monarchy more severely than simply accepting what the letter demanded. He was trapped, caught between love and duty in ways that made every previous conflict in his life seem trivial by comparison. The crown he had finally achieved after waiting longer than any heir in British history now felt like a prison rather than the culmination of his life's purpose. And as the rain continued to hammer against the palace windows, Charles understood that by dawn, everything would change. The reign that Camilla had fought so desperately to secure, that she had endured decades of public hatred to achieve, that had seemed finally stable after years of careful image rehabilitation, all of it was about to crumble, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to prevent it. The transformation of Camilla from the most despised woman in Britain to crowned queen sitting beside Charles at his coronation represents one of the most remarkable image rehabilitations in modern royal history. But according to the documents Charles now held in his trembling hands, that transformation had come at a price far higher than anyone outside the inner circles of power had ever known. In the years following Princess Diana's death in 1997, Camilla faced hatred so intense and so public that she could barely appear anywhere without facing hostile crowds and vicious media attacks. Newspapers published deliberately unflattering photographs. Opinion writers questioned her character and her right to exist in Charles's life. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming opposition to any possibility of her becoming queen. The British public blamed her for Diana's unhappiness and viewed her as the villain in a royal romance that had captivated the world. She endured this treatment with remarkable composure, understanding that time and consistency were her only weapons against a nation that had loved Diana and saw Camilla as the woman who had destroyed a fairy tale marriage. But the journey from reviled mistress to accepted wife didn't happen naturally or inevitably. It was engineered through one of the most sophisticated public relations campaigns in modern royal history, with advisors carefully managing every appearance, every photograph, every public statement, to gradually shift perception from hostile to neutral to grudgingly accepting. What Charles hadn't known, what the letter now revealed, was what had happened behind the scenes during those crucial early years. In private rooms far from public view, negotiations had taken place where Camilla's fate was decided by men in expensive suits who represented institutions far older and more powerful than any individual monarch. These weren't elected officials or even palace staff in the traditional sense. They were representatives of the establishment, the network of interconnected power structures that actually run Britain beneath the surface of democratic government and constitutional monarchy. These advisors had conducted careful analysis of the situation with cold, practical logic. They understood that Charles would not abandon Camilla regardless of public pressure or institutional preference. This much was clear from his behavior over decades. Therefore, the only viable path forward involved finding ways to integrate her into the royal structure that would minimize damage to the monarchy's reputation and public standing. The advisors feared instability above all else. They were terrified that another crisis involving Charles's love life might raise fundamental questions about whether the monarchy deserved continued public support and taxpayer funding. The institution had already been badly damaged by the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage, by the embarrassing revelations of recorded phone calls, by the spectacle of a future king conducting an affair while married. Another major scandal could push public opinion past the point of tolerance. After extensive discussion and careful consideration of various scenarios, they reached a consensus. Camilla could be accepted, but only under conditions that protected the institution from the worst potential consequences of her presence. Someone whose identity the letter did not specify had been designated to approach Camilla directly, to explain the reality of her situation with brutal honesty, to make clear that her path to legitimacy required accepting limitations that she might find humiliating, but that were absolutely non-negotiable if she wanted any future with Charles within the royal framework. That meeting, which Charles had apparently never been informed about, took place in a private London location far from palace oversight. Camilla had been told exactly what would be required of her if she wanted to marry Charles and eventually become his queen. The terms were harsh but not impossible. She would need to accept a subordinate role even after marriage. She would need to avoid any appearance of trying to influence Charles's decisions on matters of state or succession. She would need to understand that her position was being granted rather than earned, and could be revoked if she overstepped boundaries or became too politically controversial. According to the letter, she had been shown documentation of public opinion polling that demonstrated exactly how deeply she was hated. She had been told bluntly that one wrong move could trigger a crisis that might threaten the monarchy itself. She had been made to understand that she was being offered a chance that she would never receive again if she rejected it. The message was clear: accept these conditions or lose Charles forever. The letter stated that Camilla had agreed to everything without significant objection. She had signed documents that made her acceptance conditional and her position permanently insecure. She had calculated, apparently, that even a restricted position beside Charles was preferable to being permanently excluded from his life. She had been willing to accept almost any terms in exchange for the legitimacy she had craved since their relationship first became public knowledge decades earlier. The years following that secret agreement had seen Camilla gradually learn to operate within the constraints that had been placed on her. She developed skills of patience and strategic restraint that served her well in navigating those complexities of royal life. She had been careful to remain in the background during Charles's official duties. She focused her public efforts on uncontroversial charitable causes, particularly those related to literacy, animal welfare, and victims of domestic violence. She avoided any statement or action that could be interpreted as attempting to compete with Diana's memory or to claim influence beyond what had been authorized. The public gradually became accustomed to her presence at Charles's side. The absence of new scandals or controversies slowly eroded the intensity of opposition that had once seemed insurmountable. Palace communications staff worked tirelessly to present her as dignified and appropriate, releasing carefully staged photographs and managing her public appearances with meticulous attention to detail. Every outfit was chosen for maximum inoffensiveness. Every charity visit was selected to show her in the best possible light without threatening anyone's territory or stepping on sensitive ground. By the time Charles became king in September 2022, following the death of Queen Elizabeth, the groundwork had been laid for Camilla to assume the title of Queen Consort without triggering the massive public backlash that would have been inevitable just a decade earlier. Opinion polls showed that while she wasn't beloved, she was at least accepted by a slim majority of Britons. The transformation seemed complete. She had successfully waited out the hatred and had proven through years of dutiful service that she could fulfill the role appropriately. She had believed, or perhaps allowed herself to believe, that her successful performance over so many years had earned her a security that went beyond whatever agreements had been made when she was desperate and powerless. That belief, Charles now understood as he sat alone with the letter, had been completely wrong. The institution had never truly accepted her as a full partner in the monarchy. It had simply calculated that tolerating her presence cost less than the instability that would result from Charles's emotional breakdown if she were permanently excluded from his life. The moment that calculation changed, the moment her presence became more costly than her absence, the agreements she had signed decades earlier would be enforced with ruthless efficiency. The people who ran the British establishment were nothing if not patient. They had waited years, even decades, watching and documenting, building a case, waiting for the right moment to remind everyone involved that Camilla's position had always been conditional, had always depended on her staying within boundaries that others had drawn for her. Charles felt a complex mixture of emotions as he absorbed this hidden history. Anger that such decisions had been made without his knowledge, that he had been treated like a child incapable of participating in decisions about his own life. Grief that Camilla had faced such pressure alone, had been forced to negotiate her own acceptance under such unfair conditions. Betrayal that she had kept this enormous secret from him for so many years, that their entire marriage had been built on foundations he hadn't understood. He wondered whether the woman he loved had been playing a role he had never been allowed to see clearly, whether every moment of their relationship had been shaped by agreements and restrictions he knew nothing about, whether he had ever truly known her at all, or just the carefully managed version she had been required to present to him and to the world. The letter hadn't just threatened Camilla's position, it had undermined Charles's understanding of his entire adult life, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about the relationship that had defined him for decades. And as dawn approached outside the windows of his study, he realized that the worst part wasn't even what was being done to Camilla. It was the fact that he would have to be the one to do it. The changes began so subtly that most palace staff didn't notice anything unusual at first. Meetings that had been scheduled for weeks were suddenly cancelled without explanation, leaving senior advisors confused and increasingly alarmed by the breakdown of normal operations. Security protocols governing access to the king's private quarters were adjusted in ways that restricted even the most trusted personnel from areas they had previously entered freely. The guards and staff who noticed these changes understood that such adjustments only happened in response to serious security concerns or personal crises. In the early morning hours, Charles summoned exactly 2 advisors to his study. These were men whose positions and decades of loyal service made them uniquely qualified to hear what he had to share. He instructed them explicitly that no written notes were to be taken during their conversation, that everything discussed must remain in their memories alone without documentation that might someday surface and create additional complications. The phrase irreversible outcome was spoken multiple times during that grim meeting, with Charles's voice hollow and defeated in ways that made both advisors profoundly uncomfortable, despite their decades of experience handling royal crises. They understood gradually that they were discussing the monarchy's greatest institutional fear. Not scandal in the traditional sense, because the royal family had survived numerous scandals over centuries and would undoubtedly face more in the future. What they feared was precedent, the establishment of expectations or limitations that would constrain future monarchs in ways that might permanently weaken the institution. The British monarchy had survived by adapting slowly while appearing unchanging, making small concessions that seemed insignificant individually, but which cumulatively allowed the institution to remain relevant, while other European monarchies crumbled or were abolished. What Charles described threatened to establish precedents about the limits of royal power and the conditions under which sitting monarchs could be compelled to take actions against their personal wishes, precedents that would echo through future reigns and potentially undermine the carefully maintained fiction that the monarch still possessed meaningful authority. The discussion of possible responses was brief and unsatisfying because once the full situation was explained with all its legal and institutional complexities, both advisors understood that meaningful choices didn't really exist within the constraints Charles faced. Delay was theoretically possible, but would only extend the suffering without changing the fundamental outcome. The people who had sent the letter controlled resources and documented evidence that would eventually force compliance, regardless of how long Charles resisted. Denial wasn't viable as a strategy because the agreements Camilla had signed were apparently documented and stored beyond palace control, protected by institutions that had their own interests in maintaining the validity of contracts and the reliability of their archives. The only path that preserved the monarchy as an effective institution was sacrifice. And all three men in that study understood without explicitly stating it that the sacrifice required was Camilla's position and influence. Her reduction from active queen consort to ceremonial figurehead without real power or meaningful role. It was a solution that satisfied no one, but seemed to be the only option that didn't risk destroying the institution itself. Camilla herself remained uninformed about the crisis unfolding around her through that first morning. Charles chose silence when she asked cheerful questions over breakfast about his unusually early start and the succession of grim-faced advisors she had seen entering and leaving his study. She noticed the distance in his manner and the way he avoided meeting her eyes directly, but she attributed this to stress about upcoming diplomatic visits or political pressures that consumed much of his attention as king. She didn't understand yet that the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Those decisions had been made in rooms she wasn't invited to enter, that her husband was being forced into a position where he would have to choose between her and his throne. The palace continued functioning around her with its usual efficiency, with servants and staff performing their duties without visible disruption. But among those few who had been informed of the situation, there was a new weariness in how they interacted with the Queen, a subtle pulling back that someone more paranoid might have noticed immediately. Over the following days, Camilla began noticing subtle changes in her environment. Small shifts in behavior and protocol that individually meant little, but which collectively suggested something significant was happening outside. Her awareness or control. Charles became increasingly distant emotionally, even when physically present. Not hostile or angry, but absent in ways that went beyond normal preoccupation with royal duties, as though his mind was consumed by burdens he couldn't or wouldn't share with her. Advisors who normally sought her input on ceremonial matters and charitable initiatives began routing those questions through other channels, presenting her with finished decisions rather than involving her in deliberations as they had previously done. The invitations to private meetings and strategy sessions that had been part of her daily routine as queen consort became less frequent, then rare, then effectively non-existent. Her calendar grew emptier, and her influence over palace affairs visibly diminished in ways that were never formally announced, but which she could feel happening around her with increasing clarity. There was no direct confrontation where anyone sat her down and explained that her position was being systematically reduced, because that kind of explicit communication would have been both unnecessary given her intelligence and cruel in ways that violated the careful politeness that governed palace interactions. Instead, the changes happened through bureaucratic mechanisms and quiet redirections, through doors that no longer opened as easily for her and phone calls that went unreturned slightly longer than etiquette normally allowed. Camilla sensed the shift in power dynamics with instincts she had developed over decades of navigating environments where she was barely tolerated, where her position depended entirely on reading subtle signals and understanding messages that were never spoken directly. She felt the palace pulling away from her in increments too small to protest individually, but too consistent to dismiss as coincidence or imagination, running wild under stress. A private memory resurfaced during those days of growing isolation. A conversation she had, years earlier, with someone who had since died, someone who had told her bluntly that her acceptance was conditional and revocable. Those powerful people had long memories about promises made and agreements signed. At the time, she had dismissed the warning as the bitter perspective of someone who resented her success in climbing to a position they believed she had no right to occupy. She had convinced herself that time and competent performance would eventually make her position secure beyond challenge. Now, watching her influence drain away without anyone acknowledging what was happening, she remembered those words with new and terrible understanding. She recognized that she had been naive to believe that successful performance would earn her permanent security. The agreements she had signed when she was desperate and powerless, the concessions she had accepted in exchange for any form of legitimacy, had never been forgotten by the people who truly controlled access to power within the British establishment. They had simply been filed away, waiting for circumstances that would make their enforcement both necessary and possible. She finally gathered courage to ask Charles a single direct question during a rare moment when they were alone together without staff or advisors hovering nearby. She asked him simply whether she should be worried about her position and whether something had changed that he needed to tell her about. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to confront, and she watched his face carefully as he struggled to formulate a response. She saw the pain in his eyes before he spoke, saw the way he couldn't maintain eye contact with her, saw the tension in his shoulders that told her the answer before any words emerged. He didn't deny that something catastrophic was unfolding, didn't offer the reassurances she desperately needed to hear, didn't promise that everything would be fine if they just remained united against external pressures. Instead, he touched her hand briefly with fingers that felt cold and distant, telling her that there were forces and institutional pressures that even a king couldn't simply command away, that institutions had their own momentum and requirements that superseded personal desires and individual happiness. Her composure, which had served her well through years of public scrutiny and private humiliation, cracked visibly in that moment. Charles saw fear in her eyes that broke his heart, even as he remained unable to prevent what was coming. She understood before receiving explicit confirmation, understood that the life she had built and the position she had fought decades to secure were being taken from her through mechanisms she couldn't fight or appeal to, that the same institution which had eventually accepted her presence had now decided she had become a liability that needed to be neutralized. This time, unlike all previous crises she had survived through, determination and Charles's protection, she couldn't stop what was happening because the threat came not from public opinion or media criticism, but from the institutional structures that actually controlled who held power and who held merely titles. Charles found himself alone in his study once again late that night, drawn back compulsively to the letter that had destroyed his peace and shattered whatever illusions he had maintained about his power as king being real rather than ceremonial. He read it again from beginning to end, no longer searching for ambiguities he might have missed or loopholes that would allow him to protect Camilla without damaging the monarchy, but simply forcing himself to fully absorb and accept the reality of his impossible situation. The demand was stated with perfect clarity in language that allowed no room for creative interpretation or justified delay. Camilla's role and influence must be systematically reduced until she held her title in name only, while actual power and meaningful responsibilities were quietly transferred to others. And Charles himself must be the one to implement these changes personally, demonstrating his loyalty to the institution over his personal attachments in ways that would be visible to those who mattered, even if invisible to the general public. The alternative to compliance was laid out with equal and terrifying clarity. The letter indicated that failure to act appropriately and promptly would result in the documented evidence being released through carefully selected channels that would ensure maximum public attention and damage. The story would be framed not as Charles being forced into difficult choices by institutional pressure, but as him and Camilla having deliberately deceived the British public and broken solemn agreements that had been conditions of her acceptance. The damage would be immediate and potentially terminal for the monarchy as an institution, raising fundamental questions about whether a royal family that couldn't maintain basic integrity and honesty deserved continued public support. It would provide powerful ammunition to abolitionists who argued that the monarchy was an expensive relic with no legitimate place in modern democratic Britain. Charles understood that the people who had sent this letter were fully prepared to destroy the monarchy he had been raised to protect, if that destruction was necessary to enforce institutional accountability. Charles sat with his head in his hands, physically ill, as he weighed considerations that balanced love against legacy, against institutional survival. He thought about his decades-long fight to marry Camilla, about the patience and suffering they had both endured while waiting for acceptance that never came willingly, but had to be extracted through years of strategic public relations and gradual normalization of their relationship. He thought about what his reign would be remembered for centuries from now, whether he wanted to be known as the king who defended his wife against unjust institutional demands at the cost of the monarchy's survival, or as the king whose personal stubbornness triggered a constitutional crisis that permanently weakened or even ended the institution. He thought about the long line of monarchs stretching back centuries who had faced impossible choices between personal happiness and institutional duty, and about how many of them had chosen duty precisely because they understood that the crown was larger and more important than any individual who temporarily wore it. Flashbacks to Edward VIII's abdication crisis filled his mind with particular intensity. That historical precedent had shaped Charles's entire understanding of royal duty from his earliest childhood. He had been taught repeatedly and explicitly that Edward's choice to marry Wallis Simpson rather than remain king had been romantic but ultimately selfish, that it had placed personal desire above responsibility to nation and empire, that it had been a fundamental failure of character disguised as noble romance that brought shame to the royal family. Charles had internalized those lessons thoroughly, spending his entire life believing that duty must always triumph over personal desire. And yet he had also fought harder and longer than any previous heir to keep the woman he loved in his life, believing that eventually he would accumulate enough institutional power to protect her absolutely and permanently. The letter sitting on his desk proved that belief had been completely naive, that institutional power operated according to rules and precedents that individual will could never overcome, that even a king was ultimately a servant of forces far larger and older than himself. He made his decision in the dark hours before dawn, a choice that felt inevitable, even as it tore something fundamental inside him that would never heal or be whole again. By choosing the crown over Camilla, he was accepting that his life's great romantic struggle had been for nothing, that all the sacrifices and battles and years of patience had led ultimately to this moment where he would personally destroy what he had fought so hard to protect. The decision would not be announced through official channels or public statements because the entire point was handling the situation quietly and avoiding the spectacle that open conflict would create. Charles would implement the required changes through thousands of small actions and decisions, through schedules adjusted and duties reassigned, through subtle signals that palace staff and advisors would understand and respond to without needing explicit instructions that could be documented or later challenged. The mechanisms through which Camilla's power would be removed were refined and elegant, designed by people with centuries of institutional experience in managing precisely these kinds of delicate situations without creating public spectacles or constitutional crises. Her reign as Queen Consort would end not through dramatic announcement or formal removal of titles, but through systematic reduction of everything that gave those titles practical meaning, leaving her with ceremonial position while stripping away the substance that made position valuable. There would be no single moment that historians could point to as the definitive end of her influence. No specific date when she stopped being Queen Consort in any meaningful sense, because the process was designed to be gradual enough that it could be denied or minimized, even as everyone directly involved understood exactly what was happening and why. The implementation plan developed by Charles and his most trusted advisors unfolded in carefully calibrated steps, each one defensible individually through plausible explanations while collectively painting an unmistakable picture of diminishment and marginalization. Camilla's participation in state functions would be gradually reduced through scheduling conflicts and health concerns that were never quite serious enough to raise alarm, but frequent enough to establish a pattern of absence. Other members of the royal family would step forward to assume duties she had previously performed, with palace communications presenting these changes as natural evolution of responsibilities rather than as punishment or removal. Invitations to important meetings and strategy sessions would be withdrawn through quiet bureaucratic means, with her exclusion never announced but simply implemented through calendar management and access restrictions that operated beneath the level of public visibility. The language used in official palace communications and public statements would be adjusted by professional communications staff who understood how to signal institutional messages through subtle shifts in phrasing and emphasis. References to joint decision-making and partnership would disappear from speeches and press releases, replaced by language that focused on the king's individual authority and leadership. Camilla's name would appear less frequently in official documents, mentioned secondarily, if at all, creating the impression through accumulated absence that she was less central to palace operations than previous public presentations had suggested. These changes would happen slowly enough that no single alteration would seem significant, but the cumulative effect over weeks and months would fundamentally reshape public perception of her role and importance. Behind the scenes, the structural changes would be even more dramatic and consequential than the public-facing adjustments, systematically dismantling the networks of influence and access that Camilla had carefully built over years of patient work. Staff assignments would be reorganized so that fewer people reported directly to her, so that her requests and preferences carried diminishing weight in determining how palace operations were conducted, so that she became progressively more isolated from the actual mechanisms through which decisions were made and implemented. This was how reigns ended in the modern monarchy, not with abdication or dramatic confrontation, but with quiet bureaucratic adjustments that left titles intact while removing everything that made those titles meaningful.